All right, well, we're going to get started at this time. I want to do a very quick introduction, and then we'll have a prayer, and we'll jump into our conversation. So we are blessed today to have Dave Zahl with us. Dave is on staff at Christ Church downtown, and he serves as their minister to the college ministry there that they have. You may know they have a very large and active college ministry with UVA. He is a lay preacher. I know I've seen you online a couple of times preaching. But one of the main things that Dave does is also this ministry called Mockingbird, which is designed to focus and raise up an emphasis on grace and the importance of grace in our lives in many different ways. And I'm sure grace will be a key part of our conversation today. So let's get started with a prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, give thanks for this day, for the air that we breathe, for the life that we have. We give thanks for this opportunity to reflect on the gospel, the good news of our faith, to look at our lives honestly and to open ourselves to your transformation, your renewal, your hope. Be with us in this conversation. Give us open hearts and minds. All this we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, Dave. Well, Dave, I understand you have a new book out. And flip it up, I think. And it's called Low Anthropology. That's a very strange title. How many of you, just by a show of hands, have any idea what that means? All right, we've got 2, 3, all right, 4 maybe. So I think we have to start with a definition. What do we mean by low anthropology?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, by the way. It's really fun to be here. And usually when I'm driving out this way, I'm taking a kid to a soccer game or something like that. It's always like you enter this, it's just like the Shire. It's so beautiful. So it is really, to be driving here instead of down, I mean, I love downtown Charlottesville, but it does not look like this. So I would start with the second part of the title. An anthropology, we think of it as if we're in a university town and we think of cultural anthropology, and we think of the study of groups and how they work together, and tribes in the rainforest or something like that. Theologians and philosophers have a different way they use the word anthropology. They simply mean what your operating view of human nature is. So what do you think men and women are capable of? What are they incapable of? What are they good at? What are they not so good at? What are the sort of principles that govern human behavior? That is an anthropology, and everyone has one. Everyone has an anthropology. It can be a sort of something that brings you life and excitement about the human race. It can be something that fuels cynicism, but it cannot be non-existent. We all have something we mean when we say the phrase, "I'm only human." That has some content. Even Tom Brady said that phrase the other day, by the way. I know it was very remarkable. So that's what anthropology is. So in the book, I chart it on the sort of on the continuum of high to low. High anthropology tends to involve more optimistic assumptions about human nature. You find sort of grandiose visions of the human species progressing towards realization and utopia, almost. And it may not be explicitly stated that way, but this is just for the sake of the continuum. You have a much more optimistic view of human beings. A low anthropology is what I would call a more sober estimation of human beings. And this doesn't mean either human beings are totally good or totally bad. It means that what are the primary threads that bind you and I together? There are clearly, we are capable of wonderful things. But if you really want to find common ground with another person, the contention of the book is that you don't focus on the things they put on their resume. You want to look for what they leave off. Because love and sympathy and grace and ultimately faith travel on the rails of a low anthropology, which is to say, if I can admire you or respect you for your accomplishments and for your virtues and for all of the things that you're most proud of, but if I have any shot of loving you, it's got to involve the less savory aspects of who you are. And that is borne out in every wedding toast of every bridesmaid and groomsman ever made. So a low anthropology, I also, for the sake of those who haven't read the book, I sort of use Steve Jobs as emblematic of a high anthropology. When he told Stanford graduates in 2005, sort of to have the courage of your own intuition. It somehow knows what you want to become. And that sounds great when you're graduating from Stanford in 2005, before the recession hits and before Silicon Valley goes belly up and before Steve Jobs enslaves the entire human race. We all got our phones. We can feel where our phones are currently. A low anthropology is more what Anne Lamott, the Christian writer, sort of NPR mystic, I don't know how you describe Anne, but she once told graduates in a similar context, she said, everyone is broken, screwed up, clingy, and scared, even the people who seem to have it together. They're much more like you than you would care to believe, so try not to compare your insides to their outsides. Now that sounds like an abrasive statement, but ultimately you see people smile when they hear it, and you see their shoulders unknot. And it is a low anthropology.
That's great, Dave. Thank you for that description. As you, I think, were getting at in your response, it seems like a high anthropology, though, is dominant in many ways in our culture, or at least the values of our culture raise up this idea of a high anthropology. You are defined by where you went to school, what grades you got, right? We begin this with our kids early on. How did you do on standardized tests? Were you on this particular sports team or that particular sports team? So why is our culture so enamored of a high anthropology if it doesn't accurately characterize who we are?
Well, I think a high anthropology, before it throws us into the pit of despair, it flatters us, and it tells us we're people want to be on a ladder. I think that if I just know what the next rung is to climb, then I'm somehow in control of my standing before God and ultimately before the world and ultimately before God. So high anthropology promises people control. And the Bible, as I understand it, diagnoses human beings as having a unhealthy relationship with control. Control freaks. You know, I call that's sort of what it means to be in the church, is to be a part of a recovery group for control freaks. At least myself, speaking personally. But the reason I wrote the book, it sounds like it's not meant to be a downer. It's meant to be a truly relieving word, a compassionate word to people who feel oppressed by a culture of high anthropology. What do I mean by that? What are some of the primary cultural conditions we deal with today in our culture? Emotionally, and I can say this as a Charlottesvillian, I've lived here for almost 13 years now. A burnout is one of them. You hear this phrase from teachers, healthcare professionals, but you also hear it from mothers of young children. You hear it from high school students. You hear it from men in their 50s. You hear it from women in their 60s. You hear basically you certainly hear from clergy. The sense that there is too much being demanded of us, that we are on a treadmill that seems to get faster and faster with each passing year. This is the kind of what I felt as a cultural, a participant, that we were all the sense was that of the punditry I was reading, but also just my experience of my peers, was that people were life was demanding too much of them. Burnout is more than exhaustion. It's almost like a sense of betrayal or ennui or simply paralysis. And it first came into being not as relates to healthcare workers or mothers of small children. It came into being as talking about millennials. People who've been in the job market for 3 or 4 years, feeling paralyzed by the hustle economy. So burnout is one, and that I think that is directly correlated to a high anthropology. A corporate culture, but also an individual culture that believes we are capable of more than we are actually capable of. It's and college students deal with it royally. The second thing I'd say is loneliness is a major cultural factor today, and it has deep, tragic fallout in our lives and in the lives in the church and whatnot. But if you look at the mental health data, you see skyrocketing rates of loneliness. It's especially pronounced among men, but it's at all levels of the young people as well, definitely older folks. And loneliness is very often correlated to an intolerance of weakness or imperfection. So again, I can feel admired or respected for my virtues, but I will not feel known or loved if I have edited out all of the more embarrassing or shameful parts of myself. And so to the extent that there's a pressure, a mandate to never let any chinks in the armor show, there will be an increase in loneliness. It's just going to happen. Social media is the great vehicle of this, but we invented social media. It wasn't like a thrust upon us. This is just as prevalent in Christmas letters from 1950. So it's just we weren't getting them 24 hours a day. So that's that. The other thing that I mentioned in there is perfectionism. And I can speak about this. You can't really talk about perfectionism in every cultural context, but certainly in Charlottesville, where the burden of perfectionism, I was noticing a glut of books that were being written about vulnerability. And I'm talking about the work of someone like Brene Brown, but there's a lot of work like this. And they were so powerfully appealing to people. TED Talks and whatnot, talking about imperfection. And it was not just women who were dealing with this sort of shame-based sort of view of perfectionism. It was men too. When I saw the popularity of books about the importance of vulnerability, what I saw was a incredibly powerful appetite to tell the truth about oneself, but not knowing how to, and not having the vocabulary anymore to do so. And so we flock to places that allow us to be recognizably human. And so that's what this book is about. Because I believe ultimately the Christian faith, as you walk into the church, in an Episcopal church, and you talk about, God who, the desires of our hearts, the secrets, from whom no secrets are hid. This is it's not a false view of human nature.
In some sense, what you're saying, Dave, is it's a more honest view. Right?
Yes.
I want to pick up on something you said there at the very end, that we don't have the language. Another way of saying maybe is we don't have a story that helps us account for our vulnerability, for our imperfections, for our failures. The story that the culture teaches us is that, well, we just need to try harder, right? If we work harder, then we will succeed. And somehow if we don't succeed or something goes wrong in our life, then we're a failure, right? We're almost less than human. And it is interesting that the Christian faith tells a different story, doesn't it? And this, at least we could say, goes back to the Reformation. This was an emphasis, right? What is the gospel? What is the Christian story that we tell in response to an honest assessment of anthropology?
Yes, because this is the whole point. It's not to leave people sunk in their own
Right.
imperfections.
Right.
Although there's some goodness in just simply at least telling the truth.
Right.
Because when I talk about a low anthropology, I am ultimately talking about a Christian anthropology. We believe that we are finite creatures, not we're not the creator. There's a God, and you're not him. That's the AA talk, but that's what you're acknowledging by it. So I would say the Christian faith tells a story of human beings as created in the image of God and capable of all sorts of amazing feats of beauty and charity. And it doesn't really have much to say about, getting into good colleges, but it has a lot to say about loving other people and sort of the good life having to do with love of one's neighbor and love of God. But it also views human beings as profoundly in need of help. In need of help, first from other people, but ultimately from God. And so that's the view of human nature that I think that we're talking about. Now, in terms of the book, I break down the Christian anthropology into 3 sections. I talk about limitation, which is simply the fact that you cannot do it all, be it all. Despite what my children's basketball coaches think, you cannot be in 2 places at once. And yet every parent I know seems to struggle with that. And limitation is the other part of that is you also cannot know it all. And we're living in a time of warring certainties about everything. And so that sense that I can be 100% certain about anything really is dismantled by a Christian understanding of a human being as rooted in time and space and subject to various blind spots. Biases is how the culture talks about it now, but it's just what Christians would call limitation. Secondly, the second thing that the Christian faith understands, and St. Paul was very clear about this, was that we are emotional creatures, first and foremost, rather than intellectual creatures. And what I mean by that is change, misbehavior is seldom a function of lack of information. Human motivation is muddy. And it's not just a matter of me telling you what you need to do. As anyone in a marriage or anyone with children knows, motivation is not simply a matter of me telling you what you need to do and you then doing it. The movie Inside Out, the animated movie, is much more accurate. There's a state of conflict going on inside such that we have all sorts of motivations that are sometimes opaque to us. Now, St. Paul talked about that in sort of the terms of I know what the good is, but I do the opposite. That I keep on doing. And AA understands this, but the Christian faith is central. And then thirdly, we understand that there is a dark side of human nature. As beautiful and wonderful as human beings are, there is what we would call sin, self-centeredness, a sort of a gravitational pull, without which you will be without any understanding of which you will be baffled by human history, to say nothing of your own history. And so, that said, the gospel story does not leave us there. It says that, yes, these are true about you, but God sees you and loves you. And so much so that Jesus does not sees the worst in you and does not turn away. That's the grace, I think. And so I often believe when Christ is talking about sort of the law and the Sermon on the Mount and do not worry, do not lust, do not be angry. I mean, gosh, yes, I know that I shouldn't. But what do? He's driving you to your knees so that you might ask God for that which you cannot accomplish on your own. And that's where the Christian faith comes alive, I think, in the places where we cannot engineer change on our own or deliverance.
It strikes me, Dave, that what you're saying, there's a certain simplicity to it, but it's also deeply subversive. I think we just need to name that. What you're saying is countercultural to the nth degree. Take the phrase that's very common today in our society, do better, right? You make a mistake, someone says, do better. Have you ever heard that? Right? Social media, right? Do better. that somehow you can just try harder, work harder, change yourself. We have, it seems, very utopian views about what we can build as a society. Right? If we just all kind of looked at things in a different way, or we just changed our perspective, we could all come together and build something. And that seems deeply embedded in how we think about the world, how we think about politics, for instance. And it strikes me that what you're saying runs counter to that. How do we help people reframe their perspective of the world to this sort of more Christian perspective? How does the church go about doing that in the face of a culture that seems to have a very different view?
Yes. Well, I don't know 100% how to. I mean, I think that the liturgy of the
That's what we brought you in.
the liturgy of the church is a wonderful first step. There's so much in what you just said. First of all, to name the irony, there is a deep irony at work in that a view of human nature that sounds flattering is in practice oppressive. And a view of human nature that sounds sobering and perhaps even insulting is actually liberating and inspiring. Now, what do I mean by that? I think that the most transformative communities, because people hear this and they say, oh, that's defeatist, or that's shame-inducing. All this talk of Christians talk about sin. Let's just talk about the good stuff. And you want to say, well, the good stuff makes no sense outside of the honesty about one's own need. But I think the most transformative communities that I've personally been a part of or have seen, I would say two. One is the 12-step recovery programs, and that covers it. And they begin not with a view of human nature of you and I steadily progressing towards sort of some horizon of enlightenment. But every meeting begins with, I'm so-and-so and I'm an addict, and I'm here. And out of those church basements, you see love and service of other people, and you hear stories of transformation and victory and service that blow your mind. And the other one I would say would be the church at its best. You see a bunch of kind of ragamuffins, shall we say, come together, and in the darkest corners of the world, you will find Christians working for justice and mercy. And that's something that we cannot, it doesn't get publicized as much, but it's true. And yes, there are high anthropology churches that are all about doing more, being more for God. They tend to burn people out in the same way that, Wall Street burns people out. They just sort of then run away from the church forever. And that has its own scars, I think. But I view that as transformative in the extreme, the church at its best. So I think that there is something to be said. Just we need to say that this view of human nature that we are breathing like air, it is toxic, and it has an enormous fallout that needs to be. It cannot account for the data of our actual lives, because no one gets better indefinitely. If life is about getting better, who are you when when you start to get sick or your body starts to break down? Because that's the actual trajectory of human life. It's not like this, but it's sort of like this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people are dying for a word of honesty, and it's coupled with mercy. So those are a few thoughts about that.
That's great. And I wonder if I can be provocative here and ask something about our own denomination. I'm a cradle Episcopalian who grew up in a perfectionist culture in McLean, Virginia. So I know the values of our culture deeply and internalize them deeply. And I've probably heard at least 1,000 sermons in my life, maybe more, in Episcopal churches. And it strikes me that often what I hear is more about go and do. They may not use the phrase be better, but there's an implication, right? Do more, be better, be a better person, be more loving, be more understanding, be more charitable, be more compassionate. But what I hear you saying is that to even really be open to that, to be able to bear that kind of fruit, you have to first have internalized the grace and love and mercy of God. You first have to have come to God in your own brokenness, your own lack of perfection, and said, this is who I am, honestly. And I'm no longer trying to perfect myself in your sight, but I'm opening myself up to the gospel. And I think that's what I read in your subtitle of your book, that it's really internalizing that you can then actually go out and do these things that we hear all the time in sermons. Has that been your impression of our denomination and the preaching? And do we need a renewal?
Feels like a leading question.
It is.
The short answer is yes. I think that listen, I'm an Episcopalian. I was born into it too, but the reason I remain an Episcopalian is because I love the prayer book. And I love the truths and the theology that it enshrines. And that's not actually a theology of go out and do. It's a theology of go out and do the works God has prepared in advance for you to walk in. That's very different than go out and engineer utopia on your own, by your own strength. And in fact, it's also a liturgy where every single week you come together and there's a confession of sin and there's an absolution. And then you come together to the altar, and next to, whoever it is, you kneel and you put your arms outstretched. And I find that humility to be absolutely essential to any form of the good life, whatever that may be. So I love that about the Episcopal Church. I would say that that's out of sync sometimes with the messages you hear from the pulpits, which are usually deeply heartfelt by clergy who are dying to see more goodness, love, charity in the world. The issue is if you see the pulpit as essentially a pep talk to get people to go out and be different than they are, you're going to start to hate them, the people that you actually. And if people feel hated, they will not come back to church. And it's always implicit. But that's the refrain I hear from preachers who understand sort of low anthropology. They said, this was the key to loving my congregation. Well, let me put it a different way. It's not the key line in the introduction is it's not defeatist and shame-inducing to say that I cannot do it all, be it all, know it all. It's defeatist and shame-inducing to say that I can, I just haven't pulled it off yet. And if that's the message that you're getting, people will run in the opposite direction. Another thing to say is I have a friend who's a minister out in Denver, and she's a very tattooed kind of person and kind of crazy. I love her, but she was on NPR. Her name's Nadia Bolsweber, and she was on NPR, and she was asked about the message she preaches to her congregation every week. And I think there was a shooting out there, and Terry Gross was asking her, like, well, don't you tell people like that it's to be kind and to do this and that and what to believe? And she said, well, I don't tell them to do anything. She said, why don't you tell them to do anything? She said, well, and I also don't really tell them what to believe. That's sort of in God's hands. She said, well, the people that are coming to my church are staffing all of the nonprofits in Denver. And they're so exhausted and in need of some hope and some mercy that they come to church to be able to confess and to hear the gospel, to be confessed and be absolved. And that's what they need in order to keep going out there and doing the good work that they're doing. They do not need another voice on Sunday reminding them of all the ways in which they're failing. They need to be told that in their failures they are loved and forgiven. And she said she has all these kind of wacky ragamuffins show up, and the one thing that they would closed it. They said the one thing they will refuse to do without in that church is confession and absolution. And that's very counterintuitive. Terry Gross like blew her mind. She's like, well, let's talk about something else now. But I think that yes, we need renewal. Episcopalians get very nervous about sin. They think it's Baptist or something like that, and it's just not. It's in all of our, or we don't want to be sound. People today, when they hear about sin, what they hear is shame, and they hear about judgment. They think it's judgment, and it would be if there was not also grace, but a religion that doesn't allow us to bring our actual selves to church on Sunday is one that will not have much purchase in actual life, to say nothing of the world. And so I think the cultural approbation within the Episcopal Church about the stuff that we actually are saying in there needs to go. And I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to give clergy more courage in their convictions, and to know that everyone is already suffering an enormous burden of shame and guilt, and they need to hear an empowering word on Sunday, not another finger wagging that just takes a progressive form rather than a conservative form. I think that there's something that transcends that, and that is the grace of God.
Well, and in a way, that's your mission, isn't it, right? To help clergy and laity in that, writing books, but the Mockingbird Ministry as well involves a podcast, right? You have discussions on these various topics about how to live a grace-filled life. So maybe in a way, too, we need more folks like yourself doing that work, I think. So in a way, we can sum this up by saying that we want to have an honest assessment of ourselves, right? And that honesty actually leads to an openness to the gospel, which is real transformation and bears fruit in our lives. Right? That seems to sort of be the movement that you're articulating here. I think it's nicely summed up in this phrase, which I'm sure you know, of course, Luther's phrase, simul justus et peccator, simultaneously justified and sinner. Right? We're always a sinner before God, but we're also purified, justified when we hold those intentions. I think this would be a good time, too, to open up to questions. I know you all have questions about this very countercultural and provocative thesis that we've heard this morning. Yes, David.
I'm just wondering, is it really, let's just say, this particular society that we lack humility?
No, Flannery O'Connor once said that the great mark of a Christian society is humility, and as far as I can tell, it is no correlated to any national character. Which was to say, this is human nature, is to, what is original sin? Actually, it's the rebellion against God, but the belief that we can be our own God. So that is the core diagnosis of the Bible has to do with a lack of humility, driving all sorts of damage in life. So it's not a 20th century, 21st century coastal America that has this problem. It's not Silicon Valley that created it. You will find versions of it in every denomination. You will find versions of it in every country. It's just indicative to who we are. And by the way, I think part of our low anthropology is our aversion to understanding it in those terms. That there is a real resistance to or there's no sort of, I want to say this. This book is not ultimately about you understanding yourself in a new way. Because the problem with the people who are saddled with low anthropology is that we don't bear it out consistently, and we certainly don't internalize it ever fully. That's why every Sunday basically looks the same here. But what I'm interested in really in the book is trying to make a emotionally intelligible argument for God, as belief in God as both urgent and necessary. And the only way I knew to do that was to get 5 steps back and to talk about our need. Because that's, if we have, our hope is to be found in God. God is the engine of goodness and beauty in the world. And yet, it seems to me that we don't avail ourselves until we're actually in need.
Yes, Rob.
I think that, a lot of what I'm hearing is that what sells is the differences and distinctions that divide us, right? And so we're kind of in a pool of that emotional construct as a people. Because if you keep hearing how good everything is, it's just not going to sell, right? And that's kind of above the veil. But behind the veil is the grace, is the heart, is the compassion. And the solvent or the conduit to bring the word to the world is each and every moment. Help somebody with their basket across the street, let somebody in traffic, pay for somebody's coffee in Starbucks behind you, whatever it is. Because it's the small acts that actually, a drip of water on granite doesn't look like anything. And then all of a sudden you have a little bird bath for the birds. If there's enough small titration of kindness. So it's interesting because our culture does not recognize it, much less welcome it.
Titration of kindness. I think that's my next book. That's beautiful. I think like high school juniors everywhere will shudder.
Yes, Paul.
David, I'm intrigued by the subtitle of your first book. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. The first book I wrote is called Seculosity: How Career, Parenting, Technology, Food, Politics, and Romance Became Our New Religion and What to Do About It. That's literally the subtitle. They say if you're going to make up a word, you need to explain it in the subtitle. It's going to sell. So it's about replacement religion. It's about the impulse of righteousness and justification, and how it's migrated from conventionally religious venues into all sorts of ostensibly religious venues. So how we've created new religions and in all sorts of ways that mimic the old in the worst ways. Food becomes a religion, but we keep all the demand and all the purity stuff and none of the mercy or grace. And so it's based on my observations as a human being and my own in Charlottesville. The only ones I talk about were the ones that I'm complicit in. And so I feel that there is a deep desire in us to feel like we're enough or that we're righteous. And if we don't, we're going to use absolutely everything we can to squeeze water out of the stone if we're not getting it elsewhere. And so seculosity is basically about how the religious impulse, and by religion I would talk about anything that you depend on to tell you you're enough, existentially, valuable, lovable, etc. That it's the way that impulse has somehow been, for a variety of reasons, some of which are justifiable, it has migrated out from the church, and it is finding, basically, to be a person in 21st century Charlottesville, to me, felt like I was always in church, but just not the good kind. Like I was in Whole Foods, and I was being inundated with messages about purity, and should do this, and shouldn't do that, and these kinds of people do this, and those kinds of people don't do that. Or parenting, and you're getting corrected on the playground about sort of all manner of little behaviors, and every mother, I was just nonstop being told how they were mothering wrong all the time, or a career being absolutely sacrosanct in the lives of my students, and thinking that if they don't get that right internship after their 3rd year, they are going to end up under a bridge. Like that is the weight, that is the existential weight put upon those decisions. And so it's all law and no grace. And so I was trying to, in everything I do, and I don't know if the world needs more people like me.
I think so.
Talk to my wife. I think that I'm trying to translate it or marshal the resources of the Christian faith to address contemporary situations in ways that I think are intelligible to regular people. So if I could say, hey, do you struggle with feeling like you're righteous before, a holy God, to someone, at the move through, then they would say, what are you talking about? But if I said, do you ever feel like you're not enough? They'd say, oh my gosh, all the time. And it's the same basic thing.
Yes,
It
Eric.
seems to me that so much of this, especially in our society today, maybe in Charlottesville, comes down to comparing ourselves against others.
Yes.
It's like, oh my gosh, he drives that car, or they got this house, or even to the extent they get more money to charity than I do, so I need to get money.
Right.
But it's always about comparing each other, comparing ourselves to someone else. And to me, that's fraught with all sorts of things. You'll never.
So the comparison, contrasting, I'm not living up to my neighbors, I should be doing more.
I think that's, it's an exhausting and ultimately despondent way to live. Because one of the gifts of being a person in ministry or works in the church or in any helping profession is you realize that everyone is suffering. There's pain everywhere, and it might not have to be equivalent, it might not look the same, but the only reason you think those other people are doing so well is you don't know them very well. It's really the only reason. And you just do this work for long enough, and the people that look shiniest and happiest on a Sunday, just a bombshell's about to be dropped. You hopefully not. You don't pray for that, but this is why, and that makes you love people more rather than immediately judge them for having a nicer car than you. But I guess there's still a lot of that.
Well, this is a work in progress, right? I mean, part of what we're saying is that we're torn between these two anthropologies.
Yes.
Right, as you said, you need to come to church on a regular basis to hear this over and over again. Because you forget it, right? You hear it on Sunday and go, okay, great. Dave told me about low anthropology, my need for the gospel, I'm good to go. And then you get back in your job on Monday, and suddenly all the pressures begin, all the societal religions start up again, right? And you forget what you heard the day before. And so in a sense, too, we have to keep preaching and teaching and preaching and teaching, right?
Absolutely. I think that Luther himself, in the first of the 95 Theses, said the entire life of the Christian believer is one of confession and absolution. That's not a linear understanding of the world, of I'm climbing a ladder and getting better and better every day. It's cyclical, and it is, but it's true to life. It's so. Yeah, the thing is always about him is people said, why, Dr. Luther, why do you always preach the same message about, the sin and redemption, or sin and grace? Why do you keep, and he said, well, the second you start showing up as people who look like you believe it, I'll stop preaching. So.
All right, one last question. Yes, Father.
Yeah, Dave, I want to go back to your comments about the liturgy and ritual. It seems to me that that's, one of the great things about being a liturgical person and living through a liturgical life is that you do have this ritual of confession, of acknowledging, and of being open and honest, followed by absolution or comfortable words of grace that come to you. And that ritual, it seems to me, bonds us to the sacred reality that is there, the sacred reality of grace. And I was thinking in terms of my experience in the Episcopal Church about preaching and clergy that I've admired or sermons that have touched me. or made me feel whole in the presence of this liturgy. And it goes down to something that Thomas Merton once said, that there needs to be a small modicum of devotional sincerity in our life of prayer and in our life of worship, and that it's devotional sincerity that opens the door to a recognition of love and grace, that this is truly good news. If you don't have that kind of devotional sincerity, if you're not living in the moment to that reality, it's pretty hard to get across, in a perfunctory way. I would, the moment that I go into a congregation, it's the sincerity from the leadership that I'm looking for. You know what I mean? If they are sincere, if they're real, genuine, I'm attracted to it. Does that make sense to you?
It's total sense.
Yeah.
And sincere faith, though, sincere devotion is born out of personal need. And so if you get someone who's out of touch with their own need for grace,
Right.
it will quickly become a false put on. It will become a facade. But that's why it's exhausting being Christian work. It's not because of people are so demanding or something, or that you're figuring out masks or no masks. Although that stuff is tough, or pledge season. I know it's pledge season. But it's that you have to continue to mine the ground of where this is. You were actually looking to God.
Yeah.
And because that will feed your ministry. That will feed any kind of devotional life of the church.
I think too, one of the most insecure places to be is at a clergy retreat.
Oh my gosh.
You know what I mean? Because it's clergy.
There and get dressed.
Clergy can sometimes, be just as guilty of this, of not being vulnerable or acknowledging their need until there's a crisis or something happens. But anyway, I just wanted to say that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Dave, for being with us and preaching the gospel. I think that's what you're doing this morning. Give a round of applause.
I do have books available. I have a card reader if people need it.
Right over there if you'd like to purchase the book on low anthropology, and Dave will sign it.
Thank you for
too.
having me, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.